Okay, good evening, everybody. Really excited for this one. Tonight we have Gary Pritchard of Carleton University with us, who's going to be talking us through some of the history of Lake Ontario and some of the surrounding bodies of water, and sort of how it's gone through some changes over the years from being First Nations fishery and how colonialism's affected it. And talking with Gary, he's got a lot of very cool little facts and tidbits on our local waters around here. He's got a fisheries degree and has a lot of very interesting perspectives from a lot of different areas. This should be really fun. We've got a few people on here. We might give it just a minute for others to filter in. But just like any of our streams, this is definitely an interactive thing. So questions are encouraged. Feel free to drop anything that you want to ask Gary in the chat, and we'll be sure to get around to it as we can. Yeah, welcome, Gary. How are you?
Thanks, Chris. Anin, hello, everyone. I guess I'll introduce myself in the language. My Indigenous name is Giniw, which means golden eagle. When I was named, I was named because Canada wanted to bury nuclear waste on First Nation soil. So I was on Lake Superior and up there as a fisheries biologist, and they said, well, we're going to bury all the nuclear waste that Lake Ontario makes and put it on First Nation lands. And I didn't have a name at the time in our language, and that's when I was named. I come from Curve Lake First Nation, which is just north of Peterborough by Trent University. Like you said, I am a fisheries biologist. I'm also the owner of the Four Directions of Conservation Consulting Services, which is a consulting firm that represents the rights and interests of various nations across Canada on environmental problems. And then I also teach at Carlton and at Guelph University.
Very cool. You get around.
I get around. That's right.
And how long you been doing this now?
Well, it's neat. So when we moved off reserve, we moved to East City in Peterborough, which is like back in the day was actually home to most of the M&R employees. That's when they were the M&R, not the M&RF. And I was surrounded, my neighborhood was surrounded by M&R employees. So they actually got me into the trade fairly young. So I've been doing this since I was 16, and I'll be turning 43 in a couple of weeks. So it's been actually quite a long time as I put it all together now.
Very
And
cool. And like, where's that taking you? Like, have you always been consulting or like?
yeah, so I was a government employee for a long time. I worked at the Union of Ontario Indians, now the Anishinaabe Nation, but that's back in the day. We used to call ourselves the Union of Ontario Indians, up north, and then I became a consultant because Canada started cutting funding to First Nation fisheries programs. So we started to scatter, and I was picked up by a consultancy and writing fishery management strategies. Things like lake sturgeon recovery strategy, different species at risk mussels. A lot of the stuff I'm working on right now is red side dace recovery for Lake Ontario, and what are we going to do with that from an Indigenous perspective, but also from a science perspective, and how we benefit the fishery for all to be using. A lot of the work I do right now is around restoration of walleye spawning habitat to the tributaries of Lake Ontario that might be damaged by the Trent Severn waterway. People don't realize that that's a very dynamic and painful system to actually manage, both from a Western and Indigenous perspective. And there's a lot of damages happening to the fisheries, and it's really hard now with a climate change water level problem within the system as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one for sure. Yeah, definitely. Trent's, I mean, just not being from any kind of educated background on this stuff, Trent is a bit of a beast in terms of trying to manage it for a lot of different stakeholders, right? In terms of, just pleasure users, and from it just connects so many bodies of water, right? And there's so many different diverse fisheries on it. I imagine that's pretty complex.
Yeah, and you have to look at it like an aquarium, right? Because
Yeah.
between each dam, there's only so many fish that can occupy that space. And how do you manage each little cell? Well, the overall fishery might be healthy, but each segment could be unhealthy, and you have to figure that all out. And it creates a really challenging dynamic workplace, because it could be some days it's really, oh, that's not so bad. Then some days like, oh no, we're in really big trouble in these certain areas.
Right. That's interesting. Very cool. Well, people are filtering in. If anyone's just joining us, again, this is Gary Pritchard of Carleton University, and we're going to be chatting a bit about a bunch of different local fisheries, but centering around Lake Ontario. And again, you are definitely encouraged throughout this talk to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll answer them as we go. Shall I open up that that PowerPoint there for you, Gary?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Start there? Okay, cool. Gary explained to me he's just on his work Zoom here, and I guess they've got a firewall thing with screen sharing. So I'll be doing this. Hopefully it works. Bear with me. Where is that screen? There we go.
No pressure, Chris. Here's always the moment, right? When you're trying to get this to work. I'm always
It's been a while actually since I did a screen share on here. I guess I have to change some settings around. And let me know if this works now. Can you see that?
Yep, that's it. That's perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Like that's the one. Cool. All right, I'll let you kind of take it away here, and yeah.
Great. Okay, so everyone, like I said, I am from Curve Lake First Nation. We are a Mississauga or Mississauga people, and we are actually ironically the people of the salmon, or the extinct salmon known as the Atlantic salmon. Really tough to make a living as an Indigenous person, when most of your culture has been eradicated by colonial tendencies, and the salmon is a great symbol of that. I travel the world quite a bit speaking about the Atlantic salmon, and I was saying to Chris, I realized I've only actually really worked with that fish 3 times in my life. So it is actually something that my family and I've talked about, to actually get out there and fly fish for more opportunities for them, because it is something that's supposed to heal my mind, my body, and my soul. And it's really hard to do that when you don't have them anymore. So it's understanding that. And in true Anishinaabe or Mississauga culture, we'll usually start with a teaching in these spaces. So it is interesting with my life. I do a lot of Western science and also a lot of Indigenous knowledge. And I'm always excited to share environmental cues and how we actually manage fisheries from an Indigenous perspective that we've been doing for 10,000 years. And then with some of the Western science we're doing. But there's a good teaching by one of our elders who passed away. So you'll hear me introduce him as Doug Williams Bunn. And when you hear the word Bunn in our culture, that means the spirit of. Because if we actually don't say Bunn at the end of their name, we actually bring them back from the spirit world, and we disturb their journey to the spirit world. So this is by Doug Williams Bunn. He passed away during the pandemic. Great elder with a lot of environmental knowledge. He's a professor at Trent University. And we talk a lot about the disappearing animals. And then a lot of us have probably seen that in our lifetime. Fisheries have changed. Species that we've known that were normally there aren't there. Great example was the perch run on Lake Simcoe this year on my side of the lake. Really didn't happen that great this year in Barrie. So really, start taking a look around, and from our perspective, we grew up a lot of the time. The Tri-Lakes, Buckhorn, Pigeon, and Chemong is where we call home. Very significant in terms of wetlands. Our whole river system was based on wetlands, and they kept our shorelines nice and healthy, and they had such a rich life of frogs and birds. One of the birds that we used to listen to was the American bittern, and in our language we call it the muskegee, and it translates to the bird literally of the marsh. Our language is very direct on what it is, so it doesn't have to be so much guessing. And we used to always listen for the calls at night, and we knew that they fed on frogs, and so did we. Frogs are a major food source for the Anishinaabe people, the green frog and bullfrog. But the American bittern actually primarily eats on leopard frogs. And it's interesting, in the GTA and the surrounding area, we don't see frogs like we used to. So that's next time you're out in the rivers, take a look around and see if you see any frogs. They're actually disappearing quite a bit, and we haven't seen the American bittern in around our community for about 3 years. And our community is actually starting to miss them. But we also don't see leopard frogs around the community either. So it is translocation of those species. And it's important to understand that. And we need to start talking more about that collectively as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And we need to actually figure out what to do about it. You see many changes to the landscape. Our elders often talked about the eastern cougar and how that's such a mystery for the province of Ontario and MNRF and how they just started recently acknowledging Eastern cougar, but around our community up till 1958, we routinely shot cougars in our community. So just outside of Peterborough, cougars were routinely harvested by our hunters, and so that's really interesting to see that difference of discrepancy, right? And we need to start talking more about it. We also talk about the Algonquin wolf. Now, because of coyote populations, poor forestry management practices, we've now seen them shrink down to small populations. We used to have a magnificent fish called the lake trout and the sturgeon. And we also had different red horse species living in our watersheds like the Otomie River and the Trent River. We don't see them as much anymore. We don't see lake trout anymore. We definitely don't see sturgeon because of all the damming. And the big suckers have moved on and we don't see them as much either. So we need to really start talking about these things. The brook trout is another species that we've known disappeared in our territory. We used to historically know it as the red trout. And it was so common that you would commonly collect water and you'd have 4 or 5 brook trout in every stream you go to. And now you don't see that, right? And that's another fish that we identify our culture with. So we have the lake trout, the lake sturgeon, and the Atlantic salmon, and all those species are basically disappeared from the landscape. And those are things we really need to talk about.
And Gary, sorry,
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, is it similar sort of drivers behind those species disappearing, or at least not being what they used to be? Like sturgeon, obviously, it's a migration issue, maybe mostly on the Trent, but and brook trout, water temperature and water quality is such a big thing. But are there common drivers, or is this sort of a whole mishmash of different things?
Well, often when I talk about it, I often talk about it's all the colonialism drivers. It's land development, it's poor land management, it's poor resource management, it's not understanding what we have left. I look at the Red Side Dace work we do, and we have a great team of diverse people on that project to help save that Port Little Minnow. But we've done one horrible feat of science. We don't know how many's left, right? So it's really hard to manage. And I don't actually like the term manage. That's a colonial term of conservation, and we're not managing anything. These species were fine. There's a report written about the Great Lakes Ganaraska watershed that it was written in the 70s, but it actually said everything was fine till about 1600 when the Europeans arrived on the shore, and that's when it became kind of chaotic. So we need to understand that and talk a little bit more about that, and that's kind of stuff that I do. Go back in time and we recreate the landscape. And I'll take the next slide to start talking to people about what are we going to cover? Right, we often hear this is the Indigenous perspective. Well, this is the Indigenous knowledge. It's not really a perspective. One of the interesting things that we often talk about is that we have rights, settlers have perspectives, and that's some of the things that we need to uncover and untruth to make it actually a reality so people can understand these things. And we're going to cover about, what is the Mississauga knowledge of Lake Ontario. And that's what we were going to talk about tonight. Next slide, please. So who are we? Like I said, we are the people of Big River mouths and also known as the people of salmon. And we've always historically occupied, since the last ice age for 10,000 years, the tributaries of Lake Ontario on the north side of Lake Ontario. We have an old history. If you look at languages, our language is the second hardest language in the world to learn next to Chinese. And it's gone through 5 transformations. So it means it's an extremely old language. It is about 10,000 years old. And there's 9 different ways to speak it in the province of Ontario. So it's really hard to grasp. It's interesting. I am from Peterborough and like the GTA area, but the way I write it and speak it is actually from Manitoulin Island, Lake Nipissing area, because that's where I learned the language when I worked for the First Nation government up there. So it just shows you that's not that far of a space, but it actually is a language transformation in that area. Next slide, please. Our territory. We actually talk about the word territory. We don't like traditional territory because we are still here. Our population on Lake Ontario pre-contact was about 10 million Mississauga people, and now present day we're about 3,800, showing the impacts of colonization. And within that 3,800 people, there's only about 400 people that actively fish, trap, and hunt that practice our culture. So if you look at it from a fisheries management perspective, we have very little impact compared. There's 1 million licensed anglers in the province of Ontario, and there's only 400 of us that actually fish, right? So if you look at it from a statistical analysis, there is not much of an impact from an Indigenous community or many communities. And when I say 3,800 Mississauga people, that's all 7 First Nations that are identified as Mississauga people in Ontario. So that's not that many people left, and we're actually on the endangered species list. But we shared the land with the Huron, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Haudenosaunee people. But we've always called Lake Ontario home. And one of the misconceptions that you see in archaeology is that there were distinct districts of Indigenous people in it, and that's not true. We were actually always interacting with each other. Canada was a very harsh environment, it still can be those non-climate change years, and we were working together. And if you look at the Dufferin watershed, there's actually archaeological evidence showing us creating new types of infrastructure that's 5,000-6,000 years old with the Haudenosaunee people as knowledge from both communities and how we'd actually build houses and communities to live together. So it wasn't this distinct, you were over there and I'm over here. It was actually a marriage of people. And that's why we welcomed Europeans in the beginning to actually come and be a part of that community. But our territory goes from Gananoque in the east all the way to basically Lake Erie and Long Point, all the way up to Bancroft in the Haliburton Highlands. That is what our territory is known. And we sampled all the different rivers and lived among them. Next slide, please, Chris.
Yeah. You know what? Sorry, Gary. It didn't occur to me before I set this up that as I am in full screen here, I can't see if we're in the chat.
I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll put the chat in the corner of my screen. So
you have it? Is the Zoom chat though, or the YouTube one?
Yeah, it's the Zoom chat. I don't think
that one won't show up. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to run to the other room and grab something that I can see it on. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
No problem.
Figure some of these questions might be timely, and we don't want
to. That's right. Yeah, we don't want
to. Carry on. I'm just gonna pull it up here. Cool. All right. Looks like we didn't miss anything here. But yeah, again, if anyone has questions, feel free, drop them in the chat for Gary and we'll get around to them. Do you find, is there, so I mean, that is an insanely small population of your people there. Like, are they concentrated, do you find, in one area of the province at this point, or?
Yeah, we're mostly based out so there's 4 Mississauga communities around Peterborough. And we were put there by Canada during they call it the roundup when Canada was rounding us up and putting distinct family groups. Part of that was actually part of our migration. We left in the 1600s because of all the diseases Europeans and the Haudenosaunee people were bringing to our side of Lake Ontario. And then we came back in 1640 and were kind of captured and put into these distinct groups. You have the Mississaugas of the Credit on the other side, and you have us. And then you have Mississauga 8 to the north, which is in like Sault Ste. Marie area. And those are our population that we left up there historically. So we had that broad range of people. And people just don't know that we left because we were actually observing what was going on Lake Ontario. And we thought it wasn't safe for us to be here to preserve our population.
Yeah, makes sense.
So we'll start talking about treaties. A lot of people don't know about treaties. Really neat. I actually told Chris I was supposed to be at the fly shop today, but I always love coming to Toronto, and I just love that you cannot travel the distance in Toronto very easily. And so from High Park to the fly shop, it was going to take me 40 minutes because of traffic. I was like, oh, I'll just come in another day. And I was down on the shores of Lake Ontario talking in High Park today about treaties and how they all form the land to the urban Indigenous population. And it's people don't know what treaties are, and those are treaty belts that you see. And I usually bring them when I come to talk about Lake Ontario, and I have them out and people can see them. They're made from a freshwater mussel from New Brunswick. And they show that extension, right? We were going from Lake Ontario to New Brunswick to get this mussel to bring back to make currency. So that shows you the complexity of treaties. But people think they're a handout or a handshake. There's special rights given to Indigenous people or First Nations people by Canada or Canadians, and that's actually not true. We all have a set of responsibility to treaties, and that's the interesting thing, that people don't know what their treaty responsibilities are. And I'm going to kind of blow everybody's mind with some of the things I'm going to reveal that we've been researching the treaties, and people need to know too that until 1993. I was 12 years old when this took place, that it was illegal for First Nations people to actually hire a lawyer or to review our treaties. So that was a big issue. We couldn't physically touch them. And then now, as a treaty researcher who uses treaty conservation written in treaty to defend the rights of fisheries and people, I don't actually say I just defend Indigenous people or First Nations. I defend all people with our treaty rights, and so that there's fish for everyone. And it's funny because I bought all the treaties of Ontario and Canada on Etsy the other day, and I bought them on Amazon. So we went from it being illegal for me to touch them, now that I can buy them on the internet and find them. So it's really interesting to see that transformation since 1993. But every foundational part of Canadian society is based on treaty. And it's interesting because you don't get the provincial fishing regulations without acknowledging the Federal Fisheries Act, and the Fisheries Act acknowledged the treaty. And people forget that. And we need to start talking more about that, and how, like, we need to start understanding the connection between the province or the municipality to the treaty. And that's some of the stuff that we don't know about a lot. Next slide, please. So yes, there's other things about treaties. So this is one of our maps. Dear God, as a person who maps these things, I really wish Europeans had GPS in the 1700s, because good God, they are horrible. They historically followed watersheds, and in 1970, an engineer did not like the curvature of lines that you see in them, and started straightening them. So all the maps you will find on the internet today were falsified by one single individual, and now has confused the rest of Canada on treaty boundaries for everyone. But if you look at rights, treaty rights are actually like the payment of goods and monies, title of lands, the creation of reserves, the protection of hunting and fishing rights. It's not the granting of. We always have the rights to fishing and hunting. The treaty actually protects our rights to always allow to exude those rights. And that's something that people don't know about. They think that we got given these rights after we became Canada, and that's actually not true. That's actually part of that, I would call it systemic racism of Canada, that just don't know that space. The promising of school clothing and farming equipment, I ain't gonna lie to you. I've been on, I've been walking the earth now for almost 43 years in a couple of weeks. Never been given any farming equipment by Canada. Never been given any clothing, and I'm also supposed to be promised a 2 box of bullets and a rifle every year, and I've never received those things either. So we're not upholding those treaty rights. Next slide, please. This is another treaty map. Once again, wish we had GPS back in the day. Gets very complicated when you start seeing things like this, and it makes people very nervous. Try being the person that has to organize that to explain it to people. And there is treaty overlap. There's no, we had treaties amongst each other. You might hear in Toronto the dish with one spoon, wampum belt. That was an agreement between us and the Haudenosaunee people to share the responsibility for Lake Ontario. Never involved non-Indigenous people, but you see it now being more involved into that, but that actually is not what that means. We did have shared belts and friendship and allied belts that we would present to each other as we entered each other's territory. Even today, we have a Western style of governance. If I want to go fish, say, Lake Nipissing, I will actually email and write to the chief and council up there and actually be like, hey, I would like to come and harvest in your territory. I present them with tobacco, and there's a form I usually fill out. Very similar, like we still have that governance. It's not the same as you buy a fishing license and you travel, wherever you want to go with that fishing license. We have a distinct cultural protocol that we must follow as we travel across the landscape.
So these overlapping treaties were signed by different parties, I guess. That's the reason they overlap.
Not necessarily. So I think if we go one more slide, I might, yeah. So here's our treaty. So my people signed 18 treaties. So we almost signed half the treaties in the province of Ontario, just because of where we were situated. And it's shared between the Chippewa and the Mississauga nations. And that's our treaty map right there. It's one of the ones I make. And we're going to talk a bit about that purpley area that goes from Lake Simcoe all the way to the Bay of Quinte. That's a big important one. A lot of us fish in that area. So this is gonna blow your mind as what we talk about. But there was different at the time, it was just who was occupied there. And so like a lot of it was the 7 nations of the Williams Treaty occupied central Ontario, which is like Ontario and up to Lake Simcoe and all the way up to Lake Nipissing. That's our territory. It just depends on the area. So if you go to like Ottawa, for example, there's 38 First Nations. If you go to Manitoulin Island, that's Robinson Huron, there's 34. It just depends geographically where you are. But those are why you need people like me to actually know whose side it is. It's a very complicated, people wanted a flat image. It's a very oniony image. I've always, like, we're still trying to work with GIS and software to actually illustrate it in a way people can understand, but it's so complicated in Southern Ontario, it's really hard to understand. And these treaties are old from 1781 to 1923, and we actually have a new one in 2018 where we proved the MNR, DFO, MECP, Parks Canada, Ontario Parks were racist entities and denied our rights. And the Supreme Court of Canada ruled those governing bodies as racist entities against First Nations and awarded us a settlement in that process. No different than you see the settlement happening right now in the Robinson Huron. And so you're going to see a lot more of this on how this false interpretation of treaty is actually happening across Canada. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we had the Toronto Purchase and of the Treaty 13, which is the brownish area right there. And we also have the Gunshot Treaty, which was signed in 1792. And it was negotiated because we were afraid of losing control, and the War of 1812 was what was on the burner. It was going to happen, and we were really worried about that. As I would say, collectively as Indigenous or First Nations people at the time, and Canada, it was called Upper Canada at the time, and so we wrote this treaty. And this purple area from the Bay of Quinte to Lake Simcoe is basically the distance a gun, when fired, would travel. So it was very interesting. Remember in 1792, we had things like trees, and we didn't have all the, houses and condos and things like that like we have now. So apparently this is how far the gun would travel, but it was actually to protect the shoreline of Lake Ontario. That's what the intent was. And it ironically shares the, if you're ever traveling the 404 and you put it on a 42-degree angle and goes up to Vaughan, that's what we use as a treaty boundary. That's not the technical treaty boundary, but that's the close enough geographical reference that when I'm trying to explain to people where we were. But in this treaty area, it actually says that you can only own 6 inches of soil. All Europeans can own only 6 inches of soil. So I often make the joke, if you have a basement, it's legally mine and my people. We're not going to take it back, so don't worry. But that's actually what the law says. That's what the Canadian law says. This is not me saying this. This is what the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled. You cannot cut down nut-bearing trees or maple trees, especially sugar maple trees. And we actually had a food forest from Scarborough all the way to Balsam Lake with maple trees and different species of oak trees to lead us to Niagara Falls, because Niagara Falls was a very important meeting place. And that's ironically where the Treaty of Canada was signed in the Royal Proclamation. And it actually is really interesting. All the water in this area, so no water or rights to water to settlers were ever treated. So ironically, if you want a glass of water, you need to ask the First Nations for permission, which is really interesting now in today's terms, because in my reserve in just north of Peterborough, we don't have clean water. That's not a far north thing. And where my office is on Rice Lake in Hiawatha First Nation, We just got water 2 years ago. But we also protected other things 66 feet from either side of a river was First Nation land. And that was to allow our ability to travel up and down the waterways. We also protected beaver houses. Does anybody know why beaver houses were protected?
Can't say I do.
Well, ask the chat. That's the people in the chat, see if they say anything.
Give them a sec. There's a little bit of a lag on the
No worries.
YouTube stream. I noticed there. Their wheels are spinning. Not seeing any hands. Enlighten us.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy. But everybody often says, "Oh, the beaver houses were protected to secure the fur trade," right? Everybody, when they think about First Nations people, I always find it funny when we think about. I always think of for us, it's about hunting and fishing and the fur trade. That's the only things we ever did when Europeans came here. There was a lot different dynamic that people need to learn. But ironically, we protected beaver houses in all the tributaries of Lake Ontario in our territory to protect Atlantic salmon habitat. And it's funny because I talk about this now with different groups and people are like, "Oh my God, well, how does that work? Because beavers warm up the system and they take away trout habitat." And I'm like, well, no. The landscape had beavers before we had Europeans. Europeans and settlers destroyed the riparian zone and all the tree cover and overhead cover, and they warm up the water. It's not the beaver that does it. The beaver evolved in Canada to understand this. And that's the interesting thing about that fishery management. And in 1998, the Atlantic Salmon Federation of Canada, actually, ironically, on my birthday, that was the year I chose to do this profession and start pursuing it. They actually proved that you need to have healthy Atlantic salmon rivers, you need beavers. And now I want you to start thinking about that salmonid connection to beavers. And if anybody's ever gone to a northern brook trout lake and they start fishing and you see a beaver house, you go right to that beaver house right now. And that's that connection that you might not have known in your mind, but it's instinctually there for all of us because we've been a part of this ecosystem for so long. And that's some of those things that we call it blood memory in our culture, that our blood just knows to go there. And so we need to start talking like that and understanding that. So if you look at all the rivers now that you're fishing in the GTA and along the tributaries of Lake Ontario, you'll notice there's the beaver is usually missing from that watershed and how the fishery might be kind of not as productive as it could be. Next slide, please. So we do have a modern day agreement, right? That was signed after and most of these agreements are signed after 1975. And so we're starting to see things about how to be consulted and participate in, how to actually own land, wildlife management and harvest rights, financial settlements, participation in land use areas. I often talk about if we want to protect fisheries, we need to actually see what the treaty says versus what the government is saying. Because if you look at every fishery in the history of European contact, over even back in England to present day now, all we're good at monitoring with science is the collapse. You've never seen us really improve anything. You look at the cod, the lake sturgeon. The American eel was saved in Lake Ontario by using Indigenous knowledge. We've yet to use that for Atlantic salmon, even though we have that knowledge. And things like that. We need to start asking for forgiveness and asking how to best manage the resource with a magnitude of knowledge, not just one knowledge system. I'll take the next one. Go ahead there, Chris.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, it's a great way of looking at like the fisheries in the UK from what I see in general, if they're anywhere close to an area that's relatively developed or not, what they certainly were when that area was first developed. But I like your comment about the management that you made earlier too. Like management kind of invokes that idea of running it ourselves versus, you know, bringing it to a sustainable place, right?
Oh, for sure. And it's funny, right? Because like I do a lot with like the Endangered Species Act and different species like that. And I'm like, the sure bet that something's not going to come off the Endangered Species Act is actually put it on the endangered species, because then it just seems it's like it's interesting because like we talked about this about eagles the other day and everybody was like, oh, the eagles are delisted. So there was, oh, that's great. I'm like, but they're still on the list, just not as the severity that you might believe, right? So there's still threats, and I think that's the thing that people don't pick up on this, right? But I'll talk a little bit about our relationship with salmon. So it's interesting. This Lake Ontario salmon would travel all the way up to Bancroft. We have archaeological evidence, oral histories of harvesting salmon in from Lake Ontario in Bancroft, and so that's a great distance that those things would go, right? And think about what that landscape would look like before we've altered it so badly that a fish from Lake Ontario would travel all the way to Bancroft. Like that's just mind blowing to think about that, right? But we'd use torches and spears. We had fishing weirs. If anybody ever drives over the Atherley Bridge in Aurelia, where it connects Couchiching to Lake Simcoe, there is actually an ancient fishing weir underneath that bridge. And that's where many of our people, multitude of Indigenous people, would actually come and gather every year to actually harvest fish there. We actually had our own limit and regulation system historically. And it's funny, when the tree leaves grew to the size of a fox's ear, that's when we knew to stop harvesting. Because that's a measurable tangent. And the fox's ears are quite big, but the runs actually didn't happen the same way they happened in Eastern Canada. And so we need to understand that. And the reason why we lost the Atlantic salmon was actually because we started treating the salmon like a commodity, like an economy, and people were actually throwing. This is the first tidbit of the two species that vanished. You might hear Wilmot Creek is the birthplace of aquaculture and fish farming on Lake Ontario. It was actually the first river that was destroyed by Europeans, and they removed Atlantic salmon from the watershed. And the second spot that this happened was the lake herring population of the Niagara River was collapsed by Europeans as well. And the history actually talks about people in petticoats. So it wasn't my people in petticoats doing that and top hats. So we need to actually understand that. Farming has had a huge influence of destroying Atlantic salmon habitat. And our elders actually tell us that we need to actually ask for forgiveness collectively through a ceremony of healing. And that's something we've never done. We did that for American eel, and American eel is actually starting to, come back. I catch them actually in Lake Simcoe. I catch them in the Holland River, all the tributaries around Cobourg and Port Hope. We catch a lot of eels. I've even caught eels up in Lakefield. So you're starting to see that with all those dams and obstacles, we're still seeing fish migrate through. So next slide, please. So that's what a treaty looks like from a Western perspective. But things we need to understand is that our rights are protected by Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. The ability to recreational angle is actually based on your governance system, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's why the Crown has the ability to extinguish you as an individual's rights to fish. They can never take that away from Indigenous people. They can charge us, but they can't take our right to fish away or hunt. And but we need to acknowledge and be honest that we are all beneficiary to treaties, both sides of the coin, Indigenous or non-Indigenous people. And we need to start understanding that we need to get along, and that's how the treaty were meant to be. And we'll start to see more environmental protection. I use a great example of the green belt. That wasn't protected by the chairman of the Ford government. That was actually protected by the Indigenous people's treaty rights to the area. It wasn't actually anything the settlers did. So that's one of those things that, hey, if people knew more of this, we could work together to solve maybe some huge losses to the environment. Now, Chris, I'm going to ask you to pull up my story map. If there's any, I don't know if there's any questions, but we can
Seeing
pull
it
up.
should be good, but here, let me just end this share
Sure.
and pull up the other. Seeing that all right?
I don't see it actually at all right now. Oh, there we go. There we go. So this is our story map. So one of the things that we've been working on over the last 3 years since we started the company to protect the rights of nations is actually make maps. People understand maps better than if I wrote a whole bunch of, like, if I write a beautiful report that's 30 or 40 pages, people don't have time to actually acknowledge a map and how it all or and acknowledge a report. They can acknowledge a map, and a map actually will give us more data than what you know. So to give it a little bit of context, like if you look at my friend Brian helped like order put this in order for me. But the Lake Ontario watershed has gone through tons of alterations and it has a very complex history. And it's basically been declining since 1640. And we just haven't really understood how to document that in a good way. And this is some of the ways that we're now starting to pull this information together to give a more historical picture. Some of the work that we get to do at my firm, we don't try to harass the individual fish or animals anymore. We collect their DNA in water or soil or air, and that's how we're actually trying to figure out what does the ecological landscape look like. We're actually looking back in air photos. We have air photo records right to 1900. You can recreate the ecosystem to actually fix it. And so we need to start looking at those things, right? But we've had a lot of concerns around the conservation of Lake Ontario basically for the last 200 years. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that as an ecologist, you're only as good as the length of your career. So the average career used to be 40 years, and you'd work in an area, you'd get a job, and you'd work in an area, and you'd be there for about 40 years. And now that's not the case. You hop around from job to job. That's kind of even in my career, like I've had 6 major job changes in my life, and that's actually causing environmental management harm. If you look at it from that term, like we're not exposing ourselves to a long-term exposure to a fishery or a monitoring practice. So that's called shifting the baseline syndrome, right? You work in an area, say we work on Lake Ontario, we worked there 10 years, we only have 10 years of knowledge. And we're only as good as the person who mentored us into that position, right? So like when I go to my fishing spots, for an example, my father fished there, my grandfather fished there. I have all their knowledge. And that's what Indigenous people bring. Now, from a Western perspective, you're not really mentored into a job very well, and you're just kind of thrown in it and hope that you can land on, and away you go. So that's shifting the baseline syndrome, and that's actually led to the decrease of fisheries and fishery management across Lake Ontario and basically Southern Ontario. So that's actually something that when I talk about from a Western perspective, when I'm lecturing, that's something you see quite a bit. And so, historically, we had accounts of, a brilliant Atlantic salmon fishery, a huge dominant lake trout fishery, which I don't know about you guys, but I have not caught a lake trout in years. Chris, you might be too young to remember, but when I was in high school, we used to actually fly fish for lake trout in Port Hope because they had the Lake Superior strain, and we used to catch hundreds of those.
I
You
know
didn't
of
even
them. Yeah, it was before my time, unfortunately. I've caught lots, South Shore, Niagara way, but yeah, I feel like I could be wrong. I feel like I know some folks who maybe more recently than the Gani have caught them out maybe the Trent way,
right?
uh, but I'm not sure if we're talking about the same strains or what.
I don't know. Like, that's the thing. They don't post online what they stock anymore. We used to have many different whitefish species of Lake Ontario burbot. We used to have a huge bass community, walleye fishery, perch, northern pike, and lake sturgeon. And these are things that our people talk about. You see it in our artwork. You see it all over the place. And then that's actually one of the things how we've been recreating this picture is the artwork that we have.
Hmm.
And ironically, this goes to show you never not look for artwork. We actually, my brother and I found artwork at Value Village, and it depicts some of the species of Lake Ontario. And it was actually on the back of the photo. It was painted by a cousin of mine in the 40s. And we actually found the whole history of like certain species of Lake Ontario. And I'm like, oh my God, that needs to be translated. And away we go. So never look like,
It's
always
probably
keep.
more, it's probably more accurate than some of those European maps too.
Well, that's it, right? It was actually kind of funny because I'm like, first the Etsy thing, now this, right? So it's just you always keep looking. One of the interesting things about Lake Ontario that you don't know is that we used to have seals. We had seals in the Ottawa River. We had seals around Lake Ontario. We had them all the way up to Rice Lake. And there's a huge population of seals um, around the port of Oshawa. And now we just know it as Oshawa and Oshawa Harbor, but it was all around. There's a whole magnificent seal population there that was actually harvested by the First Nation people. Um, we often talk about owl life and sea lamprey. as an invasive species, but there actually is a record that they were actually historically always there. Sea lamprey historically use Atlantic salmon reds for spawning habitat themselves, so there's that interconnectivity of species there. So it might have been that historical population, and unfortunately, we just will never know that, but we do believe that.
Interesting.
So in the 1600s, this is when Europeans kind of arrived and they started writing stuff down. It was funny, up till from 1600 to 1900, there was only 23 species of fish ever recorded in the Great Lakes area because people just didn't know how to know what the fish were. But the fishery is mostly an indigenous fishery or First Nations fishery, and major rivers like the Credit were booming with our people, and we're harvesting quite a bit. American eel was another big fishery, and lake trout, and both on the Ontario and New York side. 1700, still mostly an indigenous fishery, but now the Europeans are starting to see the market for this, and they're shipping it back and forth, and we're starting to see impacts by the fur trade, agriculture as well, land clearing, the damming of rivers. We're starting to see that happen in the 1700s. But people are still able to catch lots of fish. Niagara Falls was another spot where the records say the Indian children and the French people would actually go and harvest eels with just their bare hands. There's so many eels that they just pick them up and take them up the river. In 1796, the red trout, like we know as the brook trout, were very dominant and actually be considered a nuisance on the Don River, which is hilarious. I bet you we could never catch a brook trout there now to save our life. But it wasn't until about the 1800s when things started to tank out. The fishery started really tanking out. But it was interesting because this is when Europeans started leaving the shores and venturing further in. And they realized they were catching Atlantic salmon all the way up into the Kawarthas.
Wow.
And they actually saw that. And then they also saw that my people were living off diets of lake whitefish, bass, trout, and muskie as well, and American eel, all the way into the Kawarthas. So they thought this was endless and they could be exploited as well. So with these high levels of abundance, people were not really paying attention to what the fishery could look like, and so no one ever thought to treaty it. And so this is the big mic drop moment. So in 1857, Canada at the time, it was becoming Canada, stole the rights to the fishery from the First Nations. So this is the real big mic drop moment. Fishing and the rights to, or the ability to go fishing from a settler perspective was never treated, so that you have no legal right to do it. So that is and so there's no reason to have Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Ministry of Natural Resources Fisheries branch, because they're constitutionally unsound. They're not supposed to be there. And Canada actually admitted this. We actually found this evidence at the Ottawa data bank where we actually were pulling all the treaty research. So Canada actually knew this was a thing, and they just haven't told us till now. So, and it's funny because everybody's like, well, what's the First Nations? I brought this up to an M&R meeting the other day, and they said, well, what's going to happen now? I said, we're not going to take that away from you. We never ever said that. We just need you to acknowledge that you stole it from us. And that's that piece, and understand that. And it was an indigenous economy that was actually stolen. And it goes back to the similar things that you see in the Robinson Huron Treaty settlement right now with the mining, the forestry. These are things that were stolen that were never shared. The economy was never shared, and we need to start talking about that more. Okay.
Wow.
Lake whitefish and lake herring disappeared in about 1892 as a result of overfishing. The big spawning beds of lake herring in Niagara, the Niagara River, were taken out. The landlocked harbor seals that I was telling you about were extinct by 1892 because people wanted to actually build the port of Oshawa, and they said, well, we might as well get these out of here. They're in the way. And it was interesting because these seals were actually about 100 pounds, so they were really big animals. And the sea lamprey started taking its stronghold in about the 1830s, and that's when we're starting to see the impacts of the fishery about 1830s to the Atlantic salmon and lake trout, and that's when the population started to die. Our Atlantic salmon population went from 40 to 60 pound fish down to 20 pound fish because of mortality. and that was well documented. Okay.
Did you want me to zoom in on any of these here,
Oh,
Gary?
we'll do that in a second. We'll do that in a second. We'll kind of, this is the grand finale when we do this.
Yeah.
The 1900s, right? This is when fishery biology actually took place, and we're starting to see, species have completely dipped off the map, like the American eel, lake sturgeon, industrial contaminants, especially from dioxins and other chemicals like that, were pumped into the lake. Lake trout disappeared by the 40s. And what we realized that the Trent Severn Waterway was creating was it was completed in 1920, but it actually created a super highway for disease and water contaminant transport. It allowed Georgian Bay essentially to touch Lake Ontario, and that's one of the things that people didn't realize that would happen. And it actually took contaminants from one to the other and brought it into the system. And that's one of the things that we're still struggling with managing today and how that works. Lake sturgeon disappeared from the landscape basically by 1995. No one could figure out where they were. And so that's a really big erasure of fisheries that could have been. And the knowledge that we share in these maps, these are some of our maps that we've been putting together to understand where is everything. That's the thing that we're understanding right now, is like how much space do we have left, and what are the priority areas we as Mississaugas need to help restore through partnerships with like Trout Unlimited or other resource-based groups to actually start creating a more holistic management of the landscape and cumulative effects reduction of the landscape. So we have a lot of stressors on the landscapes right now. We need to kind of understand where are the stressors, and where are the areas of that we can work on together. So if you want to blow this map up, Chris, you just have to click the thing in the corner. Oh, you can do it that way too. And just click on any of those points. So any of these points represent where Atlantic salmon has been captured, right? And where was it captured from, and all the data and how far it's traveled.
And these are documented just through catch reports or through
These
the
are
DFA?
these are catch reports. Yeah.
That's interesting. Just looking at this, looking at little clusters, I don't know if that's the cluster I would have pictured down there. Mind you, I'm not somebody who trolls Lake Ontario, but don't feel
Well,
like
it's neat, right? When you start spatially putting this stuff together, it has a lot to do with like and that's the question we always ask too, is like, why do they want to go there?
Mhm.
What is bringing them there? Some of it has to do with slope. Atlantic salmon, for example, these are Atlantic salmon hits, like a river of a 13-degree slope, because of agriculture and road sand infilling a lot of this habitat. We're down to about an 8 to 10-degree slope. So we need to actually clean, and we don't get those big flushes anymore. I don't know if you fish Gage's Creek at all, but that was one of my childhood creeks as a kid. And the river mouth has changed completely different. And if you actually took particle analysis size of that sand, that's all MTO road sand. That has nothing to do with naturally the system. That's us putting that in the system. And we don't have those freshettes anymore, whereas like I do a lot of studies of headwaters, and I'm like, so did we have freshet this year? Right? We didn't. And then I think we had it a couple of weeks ago after spring has already happened. So it's trying
Well,
to
they're barely down in BC now.
right? Like it's just trying to understand that, and where are these priority areas?
Mhm.
That's kind of neat, right? If you move down to the next map,
That's one. Yeah.
yep, that one. Let's go down to the bottom. So I just gotta make sure I know. This is like all the areas in green where the salmon actually were occurring, and the rivers are in black that show the major spawning system. So it actually shows you, if you go up to the corner, Rice Lake as well as part of the major spawning areas, right? Who would have thought Rice Lake would be a major spawning area?
Are they spawning in the lake or in the
Yeah, they'd
treaty?
actually go up the Autonomy River.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then the Indian River, ironically, it's actually the Indian River is one of my favorite rivers, but big muskie spawning habitat too. But it is actually another great river that had Atlantic salmon in it as well.
Yeah.
But it's just neat to see the kind of these things that these are the watersheds where the salmon were, right? And how do we, like, maybe that's a priority that we all make as a commitment to actually start restoring those watersheds and actually understand the functionality of these watersheds better. Ironically, on our side, if you look at the GTA side, most heavily pressured watersheds with development and effluence and things like that. But maybe we can save some stuff around, the Coburg to Belleville side of the watershed. I know the states actually have a different. The states are actually really doing a lot better for restoration and management. They actually outbeat us. I would say 9 times out of 10 on fisheries management.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, having fished those.
Yeah, right. Like I'm like, oh, it's just,
Yep.
yeah. I always hate admitting that. And well, we can go down to the next one.
Yeah.
What was this one? Just scroll down a little bit more, Chris. So this one is the areas of the major dams that need to be. So this is the interesting piece that we've been working on with different species indexes of like, what are the environmental influences that need to be removed? So these are major dam networks that need to be pulled out to actually have that connectivity piece again.
Hmm.
So you might know these dams, like if you look at the one in Port Hope, there's the one that's the Ganaraska fish ladder right there that you all know,
Yeah.
has bad fish passage. I've actually don't know what the Trent that one is actually. I don't
Yeah.
think I've been to that one.
That's the Moira there.
Yeah, I wonder if that.
Yeah.
But I'm used to seeing the dam further on the 400, 401 there. I don't know what that dam is, but that's been identified as the connectivity threat.
Mhm. And that's the Napanee, or
Yeah,
no, Napanee's over here.
yeah, sorry, that's that one. I can't remember that one. There's
Oh, is
another
that the
one.
salmon? Because we have a salmon river on our side too.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah,
Kingston's a little far in my territory for me to go.
yeah. Same here. Yeah.
But yeah, and so it's neat to actually start mapping these things out to show
Mhm.
priorities, right? And if
Yeah.
you go down one more, this is actually where the major seal populations were. So the stars are where the seals were. And it's just neat
Really
to,
isolated, eh?
yeah, right. It's just good habitat. But you see that on the coast too, right? Seals only live in certain spots that they like, and when they take it over, they really take it over. But it's interesting because now that we've started talking about seals, they're like, hey, yeah, we saw one at the OPG Cornwall Dam not too long ago. And I'm like, yeah, it's just sparking that conversation.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Never, I mean, it makes sense. Why wouldn't we have them? But
I
also,
wouldn't, yeah,
I've
right?
heard of 'em. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the critical habitats in red and things that we need to start fixing up.
And those are critical habitats for the salmon.
Yes. Yeah, this is
Oh,
our
yeah.
salmon map.
Yeah. Yeah.
We could do a red side dace one later. It's actually kind of funny when we mapped this for red side dace. We actually showed from housing development all the headwater trees that were removed on the streams and how it influenced a kilometer away and how that took away the habitat for the dace. So something so far, what we would say far away, removed critical habitat and thermal refuges away from the fish.
Yeah.
It's stuff like this. You can do this analysis. Anybody could, this is all open source data. This isn't secret data that's not, this is all on the internet. And we were able to pull this all together.
What kind
So,
of sources are you using for this for the most part?
oh, I'd have to ask. So I actually have experts now, Chris. I have, so but a lot of this is like iNaturalist we use Fish Online. There's a lot of NHIC database. There's a lot of different things that we pull together to kind of create this because that's the thing, no one's putting all the picture together. Right.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that we talk about is that it's great that we now have our rights back in 2018, but how much space is available for everyone, especially in the GTA, or how do we create co-spaces together? Where can we create like we always talk about like, I remember when I first moved up north and they made that blue ribbon fishery book for Southern Ontario, and how do we enhance those areas? And that's the things that we're talking about as Indigenous people now. Like, how do we get to create areas to benefit everyone and fight climate change and fight drought and fight the fire threat and things like that. And this is the stuff that we need to start mapping together.
Very cool. And what's I mean, it sounds like you're probably consulting and working on a bunch of things at once here, but like what kind of projects are you most excited for these days? Or is it more the intel gathering to sort of kickstart this stuff?
Well, some of the work that we're doing is actually going back in time and gathering all the knowledge from the elders and all the histories that their parents and grandparents passed to them. So some of the things that we've uncovered is like my great aunts and uncles were recorded by Trent University. you're probably too young to remember this thing called a cassette. Um, so I've had to digitize them to DVD and now digitize them to like just a MB4 file. But it's actually neat to hear like their voices again. I haven't heard them since I was a kid, but now we're able to take their knowledge, put it in this kind of mapping form. We're working with the NVCA on lake sturgeon, the oral histories of lake sturgeon, red side dace, looking for just like what was there, but then also like what do we have left? So we're actually looking on Lake Ontario right now for deep water sculpin using environmental DNA as well as GoPro action cameras and electrofishing. It is actually quite dynamic, some of the stuff we get to do, but it's actually just out there looking. Um, and it is actually quite fun because if you're out there, one of the things that we learned during the pandemic when we were taking our kids, they were littler then and the pandemic started, but we actually caught a rare sunfish, the northern sunfish in the Holland River, and the government didn't know that was there, and now it's spawned off that we have 16 different sites with that little rare sunfish in our territory, and what does that mean, and how many do we have, and how does it work? So it actually it is a testament to actually for people to get back out, all people to get back out in the land and actually start fishing and actually take a look around what's around you, right? And then understand that. And if you don't know what you've caught or what you see, take a picture of it and send it to an expert like myself or others to help you figure out what that is. And then we can record that to help protect the environment later.
Yeah, that's wild. If the next guy over had caught that thing, who would know?
Well, that's how it happened. My daughter caught it and she was just like, Dad, this is a weird looking sunfish. And
Yeah.
I'm like, that's a big deal, right? And so
It's wild to think just like how much info is out there on everything these days, and that's still sometimes just what it takes to figure something out, right?
well, especially with the stuff we do with environmental DNA, it blows my mind because like I use a lot of cameras. We use like, a lot of GoPros in the creek to see who's living there, and then we use artificial intelligence to sort out what species is in there by camera recognition. But
Mhm.
then it's just like, oh, some days it's just fun to go down to the creek and see what you catch, right? Just throw a minnow trap in and away you go. And yeah, it's just that the whole importance that you need to get outside and take a look around. You can't rely on sitting behind a desk and figuring this all out. You need to get out there and talk to people and be a part of that landscape.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's really cool. Is there another map? There is another map. Look at
There's
that.
another map.
Done. What do we got in this one?
So all the black spots were they actually said the habitat will never come back. So it's always I don't know why we leave this as a side map at the end. And but there's still hope for other watersheds that are to be rehabbed.
That's interesting. There's a couple on here that, to be honest, would have surprised me that they would be complete goners. I mean, looking at some of these eastern creeks here, I mean, that's Port Hope there.
Yep,
That's or no, is that
that's
Gauges?
Port Hope. No, that's Port
That
Hope.
is the Ganny, and
Yep,
that's listed as a
potential to come back. Yep,
yeah, yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. The
yeah.
red spots are the.
The dots are
Oh,
actually
okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay, agreed then.
yeah.
It is pretty wild, like looking to your point, how upstream changes have big knock-on effects. Like I'm always amazed looking at like the Toronto area. You've got the Humber River out on the west end of the city. You've got the Rouge out on, or maybe take it one further, Duffin's out in Ajax. And this whole area is as urban as it gets. But then just depending on what the headwaters systems are like, completely dictates what the fisheries like below. Like the Rouge has, decent runs of steelhead. Duffins has good runs of steelhead and a healthy resident trout population just because the little headwaters change compared to the Don that runs, through the city, head to tail is, you just have that a little bit more intact.
Yeah, it's neat, right? And you see those, and just imagine if it was completely intact,
Mhm.
right? Like how great it would be. And it's interesting too. It's like going back in time and doing all this research, like like the Don was so polluted when the Queen came to visit the first time, they actually poured perfume in it to make it smell better. Like that's the history of the Don, right? And it's like, oh God, that's gross. It's just like understanding that, right? And what are easy projects to take on and to bang out. Uh,
Mhm.
that's the other piece too, because if we start getting that positive momentum, we can actually achieve more. Because it's not just if we restore the habitat for one, other fish will follow, right? And that's one of the things that we talk about when we do ecological restoration is that we're not restoring it to brook trout or for Atlantic salmon. Those are really like big wants. But what are other species that trigger a positive restoration and continuation, right? Like it's interesting. I'll use a bird species and because I've been doing a lot of stuff with birds lately, and the red-winged blackbird should be endangered because they're down to historically 50% of their population. You still see lots of them, but they're down to 2.8 million. They used to be 5.6 or 6.3 or something. So that triggers the Endangered Species Act. It just wouldn't happen like that now because of the way the political system works. But if we could have a measurement of red-winged blackbird come back, this other species will come back, turtles will come back, and we can see that whole ecosystem. And that's the thing too. We have to stop looking at restoring ecosystems for an individual, but collectively for a fish community and a mammal community and a bird population as well. It's a holistic restoration, not just singular. That's the downfall of what we've been doing in this province.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm sure there are more local examples, but just brings to mind the whole Yellowstone wolf thing that, went around back where, reintroduction of wolves, helped keep bison populations in check, which helped bring fields back and less trampled riverbanks, and trout came back, and, all those knock-ons. So yeah, pretty neat. Very cool. Well, this has been awesome. This is kind of the last screen to share, right? That you
Yes,
had.
that's the end. Yep.
Okay, just want to make sure. If anyone wanted to get in touch with you or your group to learn a little more, did you want to drop any contact here?
Sure, I can. I'll just put
It
it.
was in the. You know what? Hang on. I'll cut myself off there because it was in your slideshow, I think, wasn't it?
I think so.
It is. Let
I
me
just
see.
put it in our chat.
There we go. Yeah, any closing thoughts you wanted to leave with us? Be awesome if you have any. This is really, really fun.
Yeah, it's I think the closing thought would be like one of the things that I find interesting when you look at fisheries management in the province and conservation, it's still we feel like it's us versus them, and we really need to start talking about our shared history and our shared past, and what can we learn collectively from it to actually move forward in the future, and not make those mistakes again, right? And that's one of the things that we really need to look at because I think that's important. When I teach how to work with Indigenous people, I don't teach about the history. I teach about how are you going to do this today, right? And so how do we move this dialogue to a more modern day context, understanding that we are doctors, we are lawyers, we are scientists, um, and so that it's not a nervous thing. And I like people to realize that you don't be nervous when you come to work with First Nations. When we have a shared interest to restore an area, it's a moment of excitement. We just might need to actually, and it's a positive thing. We don't get a lot of positivity. So we need to actually find those good projects to actually work together and move forward together.
Yeah, that's awesome. One or a couple actually last minute questions sneaking in here. Patrick was asking if you had an idea for what is one actionable step that you would say anglers could take towards reconciliation in our sport.
Yeah, so I've been actually working on that one for a bit. That's a great question. So one of the things that people really, we had this the other day. So I'll share a personal side of my life with you. We are out. I don't, as a fishery biologist who restores a lot of fishery, especially walleye and things. I'm usually out monitoring when everybody else is. My people are out traditionally harvesting, and people don't realize when we're traditionally harvesting, we're very selective of what we harvest, and there's a lot of racism we face when we're out traditionally harvesting. So I've already told you tonight that out of all our people left in Southern Ontario, there's only 400 of us that harvest across a giant geographical area. And I often use the example on any given weekend, there's 400 of my people harvesting all year round. There's 24,000 people fishing Lake Simcoe every weekend. So we need to start statistically looking at that. So when you see Indigenous people out harvesting, understand we've been doing that for 10,000 years and we never had a problem. So we're actually not destroying the fishery. And we had a man come up to us. We were out there harvesting walleye during the spawning run, and the man came up to us, started calling racist slurs at us. And I actually thought he was pretty brave to, a singular old man approached like 9 giant indigenous people, and I was like, man, this guy's either mentally insane or he's going to beat us all up. And the people started getting really mad at him. And they started arguing. And I said, okay, guys, I got this. And I pulled him aside and I said, sir, you need to understand, like, we've talked to you about Section 35. We're allowed to legally do this. You legally have no rights to water, and you legally can't be fishing, actually, as a settler. But I said, the interesting thing is, I said, sir, what you don't understand is that I'm the biologist who restored all these spawning habitats for walleye in the Kawarthas, and I happen to be an Indian. And I said, how do you feel about that? And I used multiple knowledge systems around that. And I said, we're not hurting anybody. What's the difference from me harvesting 4 fish right now than you shooting a deer when it's trying to mate? I'm not genetically selecting the best deer like you do with a Western hunt for the biggest buck, right? You're always shooting that 12-point buck to make that big trophy antler. You're genetically weakening the population by how you harvest as a Western person. We're harvesting only male fish tonight. And we're also taking the fish and we're taking their gametes and putting them in our hatchery that you don't know that we have on the reserves to release them back into the Kawarthas. There's things you don't know about us, but I'm the one that designed all these shoals. So everybody gets to have fish because of the projects we do, but no one knows that. And those are those moments where, hey, like, let's get together and design that and advertise that and show that together. I also think signage. Be a supporter of us. If you see us spearing an invasive Lake Ontario salmon, don't be criticizing. But that's something that we're trying to reinstall our rights, because they've been denied after 100 years of the MNR DFO being racist entities. That's how the Supreme Court of Canada labeled them as in 2018. We're trying to reinstate our culture. It's no different than someone going to a place of worship. And we just need to have that common understanding, right? And if you have questions, feel free to walk up in a nice, polite way and ask us. We'd love that. We'd love to share you some. One of the great stories about walleye I can share with you today is that, did you know the walleye this year started spawning on February 27th in the Kawarthas, because our oral history tells us that they spawned after the first lightning strike, and that's when we had the first lightning strike, was on February 27th. And it's funny because our fish do not know how to read English. They're Anishinaabe fish that live in this area, and they can't read a calendar, an English calendar. So understanding that there's this whole world of difference that no one's even bothered to ask for.
Yeah. Yeah. So reach out and learn and, ask good questions and spread good knowledge. Be a great place to start. Very cool. One more from Rob. The introduction of West Coast salmon species. What is the Indigenous or your perspective on the environmental impacts of the introduction of those species? I mean, you just labeled them as invasive, so
Yeah, so they're invasive, but it's but invasive to us is different than the word invasive to you. So to be honest, like that, there is stories of migration. We have stories of the light-skinned race coming to migrate here and teaching us a lesson. And I think that lesson's when the Europeans came and just basically decimated our population. It taught us resiliency, and we're still here and we're still thriving. So that's how I look at that. And it's no different than these species all have something to teach us. And we just have to ask the right question. So I've never, like, when people talk to me about invasive species, I know that species has something to teach us. So I'm not as like, oh my God, it's an invasive species the same way as other people are. And that's never been a Mississauga or an Anishinaabe teaching to instantly go out and kill everything that they've seen. Because if we did that, well, it'd be a different story here in Canada than it would have been. But we need to actually start looking at what that species is here to do. And so we don't look at it as negative. And I grew up fishing since I was, 8 years old, the Gani and Port, the tributaries around Newcastle and Cobourg, thinking those were what salmon looked like. I didn't know this whole history until I became much older. So the Chinook salmon of Lake Ontario brought me and my family a lot of enjoyment. So we don't see it as a negative at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, obviously that's a very far removed species from its actual home, but a lot of even without, human involvement, there's always, changes in environments too. And, species adapt to new environments and find their way into places they weren't before. So I'm sure nature will find a way there.
Well, exactly, and like it's funny because we'll talk about brown trout. I always find funny about brown trout. I believe they're the trout that's going to survive climate change, just so everybody knows. But everywhere you look at colonization, whether it be the Bahamas, Africa, India, New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea, everywhere there's been British colonization, there is brown trout. That's the fish that falls around, and no one seems to ever talk about that, right? And so that's the fish of the royals, is what they used to call that. So it's you know, and so it's just like understanding those spaces. It's just having that conversation, right? And just saying, do you actually know the history of this fish, right? And what it means to people.
Mhm.
It must have meant a lot to bring brown trout all over the world to
Can't
share the
imagine.
fish, right?
Bahamas is the new one. Haven't heard that one.
Hmm.
Yeah. They still have them there?
I don't know. Actually, it was my one boss. I had a boss that was from the Bahamas, and him and I talked a lot about colonization. And I was part of a water group for Lake Ontario. We talked about it was a bunch of mixed race people. We all talked about the different countries that are affected by colonization, and there's this whole list of species like European buckthorn, carp, all these different species that had this common migration pattern with Europeans. It was actually I thought that was really neat to have that conversation because we wouldn't have known that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, once you start thinking through it logically, you're right. Every single place that they've touched, there are brown trout. That's pretty wild. Very, very cool. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, but Gary's email is up on the screen there if anyone does want to reach out with any follow-ups for him. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you for doing this. This has been really cool. Definitely learned a lot tonight and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Well, everybody have a great night. And in our culture, we don't have goodbye. We always say Bamapi. That means till I see you again.
OP.
Right.
We'll
Take
chat
care.
soon. All right. Have a good night.
Yep, take care now. Well, that's it, Chris. We're good.
Yes, we're good.
All right, buddy. Well, I'm going to sign off, but I'll send you an email with